As of January 2023, James Cameron's Avatar: The Way of Water has grossed over $1.9 billion at the global box office, and in only 1 month has rocketed itself to the number 6 spot on the top 10 most successful movies ever made. A list which contains 2 other Cameron films, Titanic sitting at number 3 and Avatar sitting at the number 1 spot. This level of success has rocketed him to becoming the second highest grossing director of all time, beaten only by Steven Spielberg, but was achieved by directing only 9 films. Now, the man is obviously doing something right when it comes to the profitability in filmmaking, and I think it's time we really analyze how James Cameron dominates the box office. The Canadian-born filmmaker moved to Southern California at the age of 16 with his father. Despite being fascinated in a variety of subjects such as engineering and marine biology, Cameron admits not to being a very good student and dropped out of college only a year in. From there, he did a variety of odd jobs such as being a janitor and a truck driver. But during this time, he became interested in filmmaking and wrote scripts in his free time. Instead of going back to college to study film, Cameron would rent out books on special effects and optical printing from a nearby college library, photocopy the pages, and feverishly study the binder's worth of copies he got. It wasn't until he saw Star Wars in 1977 that he decided to pursue directing full stop. After borrowing money from a group of dentists looking for a quick tax write-off, Cameron accumulated $20,000 to direct a short film titled Xenogenesis, which would act as a proof of concept for a feature film based on it. And while a feature never materialized, it did turn a few heads in the filmmaking world, one of which was a man named Roger Corman. Now, if you're not aware, Roger Corman is an extremely influential figure in filmmaking. Known for producing low-budget midnight movies throughout the 50s through the 80s, but gave the start to many up-and-coming actors and filmmakers. Some of the most notable being Jack Nicholson, Martin Scorsese, Ron Howard, and Francis Ford Coppola, just to name a few. He hired Cameron on as a model maker in the studio, where he worked on movies like Battle Beyond the Stars and Galaxy of Terror, the latter of which he also served as the production designer and eventually progressed to the second unit director, where Cameron claims he directed about a third of the overall film. After this, he was hired as a special effects director for the film Piranha 2: The Spawning, although this was due to the original director dropping out of the project and the producer frantically looking for a replacement. But this turned out to be an utter disaster for the up-and-coming director. With a crew that spoke little English, shady budget origins, and constant clashes with the producer, Cameron was fired mere weeks after getting hired. And all this hard work didn't even prove itself, as the film was a critical and commercial bomb. While working on the film in Rome, Cameron suffered a fever and had a nightmare about an indestructible metal skeleton. This image quickly manifested itself into a film idea, and he wrote out a draft for a script that would eventually become The Terminator. While shopping the finished script around, there were several studios who were interested but refused to buy it due to one condition: he wouldn't sell it unless he directed. Now, being an underground director who couldn't even complete his first film made some studios a bit turned off, to say the least. However, he was able to secure funding through Hemdale Pictures, who granted the production a modest $6 million budget, which for this type of project was generally tight. To get around this, they filmed most of the scenes at night without permits, and every member of the production had to double or triple up on their duties. Luckily for Cameron, he was able to get one of the most bankable stars in Hollywood at the time, Arnold Schwarzenegger, in the lead role, who, Cameron admitted, he didn't even want in the film until he met him. Despite budgetary setbacks and early reviews saying it has a B-movie premise, it was a smash hit, making over $78 million against a $6 million budget. A very respectable sum given how it was up against other massive sci-fi blockbusters that year like 2010 and Dune, both of which vastly underperformed at the box office. Through this, Cameron was able to land a job directing the sequel to the widely acclaimed film Alien, called Aliens. He had been writing the script for it while developing The Terminator, but when asked to turn in the unfinished draft, it impressed the Fox executives so much that they stalled production on Aliens just so he would be available for it. When he was finally able to direct the film, he was given much more resources at his disposal, such as large studio backing and a beefier budget, this time around $18.5 million. A larger sum than what he had on Terminator, but still somewhat inadequate given the scope of the project. In reference, let's compare this to the $11 million budget given to Alien. Both in the mid to high budget range for the time, however that film was much smaller in scope, contained very little action, and had far less visual effects. This also wasn't aided by the fact that Cameron constantly clashed with the British crew, which a lot of whom felt some kind of loyalty to the first film's director, Ridley Scott. Despite all of this, Cameron proved that he was able to deliver the film within budget and maintained the massive scope he envisioned. A lot of the praise goes to Cameron's background in art direction, engineering, and visual effects, which he implemented to achieve the, at times, extremely complex action scenes, as well as surrounding himself with an incredibly talented team, consisting of people like visual effects supervisor Stan Winston, whom Cameron worked with on the first Terminator, who were able to find ingenious ways to cut costs on things like the lavish sets or the Queen puppet. Aliens released in the summer of 1986 and became an enormous success, raking in over $183 million, and early the next year was nominated for an impressive 8 Academy Awards, taking home 2 for visual effects and sound. Despite the troubled production and Cameron's relative inexperience directing up to that point, he was able to prove that not only could he deliver a film with a bigger budget that pleases fans of the original, but also have his second film in a row be a massive hit at the box office. Now, when talking about the budget, let's take a look at another effects-heavy film from around the same time which had almost the same budget. I don't think you'll find too many video essays praising the ingenuity in those scenes. But why is it that Aliens was able to squeeze every bit of value out of its budget and make it look like it was double or triple the size? Well, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that Cameron by nature is a more technical focused director. As he started out in departments like model making and art direction, naturally those elements are going to be given the thought and care they need versus a director who's unfamiliar with them. This fascination with pushing what could be done visually in filmmaking would lead to a breakthrough that would change the trajectory of Cameron's career and in turn the entire entertainment industry. Shortly after the release of Aliens, Cameron got to work on his next project, The Abyss, a film about a team tasked to recover a nuclear sub which sank in the ocean under mysterious circumstances. Armed with a hefty $70 million budget, he got to work, this time with much more creative freedom behind him. As you would expect, the movie would feature top-notch effects, except there was one that would take more man-hours and technical skill to pull off than anything in his previous films. Around halfway through the film, there is a tentacle-like spy device called the pseudopod that is used by the aliens in the film, which is made entirely of water. Given the effects typically used at the time were mainly practical and optical, there weren't too many options to pull this off in a convincing way. That is, unless Cameron wanted to look for alternative methods. Now, CGI had already begun cutting its teeth in film throughout the 80s. However, it was often rudimentary, symmetrical, and solid. A more liquid and malleable surface hadn't quite been done like this yet. Nevertheless, Cameron trudged on and recruited one of the only people in the industry who was familiar enough with CGI, Dennis Muren, to take on the challenge. The mere 75-second sequence took 6 months for Muren and his team to complete. But once it was completed, it instantly made waves throughout Hollywood, as once again, something like this had never been done before. In the summer of 1989, The Abyss was released. And while not necessarily a smash hit like the previous 2 Cameron pictures, the film was still seen as a landmark for visual effects, and took home the Oscar the next year for Best Visual Effects. Cameron kept up the momentum that he had since his first film, and got to work right away on his next one. And what else would it be but a sequel to The Terminator? The film would take place 10 years after the first, sporting John Connor, a character whom we only hear about in the first film, as the main character. Sarah Connor with a completely new persona, this time at a mental institution for attempting to blow up Cyberdyne, and Arnold back as the T-800, but this time in a new role, going from the antagonist to the protagonist. Just as each film before it, Cameron upped the scope, adding a more complex story and larger action set pieces. But above anything else, with the initial budget of $90 million, Cameron sought to bring to life an idea that he was manifesting for quite some time: a fully realized CG character. It's no surprise that the pseudopod in The Abyss gave him the confidence to attempt this, but funnily enough, the concept of a liquid metal Terminator was actually an unused idea he had from the first film, which was scrapped pretty quickly for budgetary reasons. Bringing back Dennis Muren and dedicating $5 million of the budget to the CG alone, the team at Industrial Light and Magic, the subsidiary of Lucasfilm which had been developing the CG in Cameron's films, the 35-person team worked tirelessly to complete the mere 43 or so shots it took to bring the T-1000's effects to life, which only amounted to about 5 minutes of screen time. It also probably didn't help ease the pressure when there was no backup plan if this were to fail, as it would have been impossible to recreate anything close to it practically. Terminator 2 released in July 1991 and was a monstrous hit, racking in over $520 million, making its budget back 5 times over. And early the next year won 4 Academy Awards, one for, as you can guess, visual effects. Despite the film going over budget by about $10 million, Cameron was able to keep the large scope of the film intact, maintain his creative control, and deliver a film that once again gelled with critics and audiences. In only a few years, Cameron, who had previously not worked with CGI and frankly had little interest in it, became relying on it more and more to bring his visions to life. And in 1993, he co-founded the visual effects production company Digital Domain. Around this time, in 1995, he wrote a script based on an idea he had of having a cast made up of CG characters acting alongside live-action ones. However, he decided that the technology at the time wasn't up to what he had envisioned and shelved the idea until a later date. More on that later. The next film Cameron had begun working on was True Lies. After he could never crystallize a story for Terminator 3, he decided to put his efforts into a comedy. This time with a production budget of $100 million. The first film to have an initial budget of that size. And while it received more mixed reviews and wasn't as much of a smash as his previous films, it was once again profitable and showed that he was yet to have any type of film that would sink at the box office. In fact, sinking is what everyone had predicted for the next film he would make. Cameron had been fascinated with the ocean his entire life, taking scuba lessons as a child, and as previously mentioned, expressed interest in becoming a marine biologist and lived by the ocean in his adult life. We see this interest come out in The Abyss, but it's one that permeated into his next project in a much grander way, but also departed quite a bit from his previous work. In 1985, oceanographer Robert Ballard discovered the wreck of the RMS Titanic, which sank in April 1912 and claimed over 1,500 lives, and is now considered the largest maritime disaster in history. This is all stuff you probably know, but believe it or not, the story of the Titanic was not as well known at this time aside from just hearing about a large ship was sank. After this event, Cameron became infatuated with the legend of the Titanic, scouring over every book there was on the subject and even taking several dives himself to the wreck. He got to work fleshing out an entire film based on the Titanic, a 3-hour epic starring Leo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet as the fictional Jack and Rose, who serve as vessels for the audience to see the wreck through their eyes. When pitching the idea to 20th Century Fox, they granted him a $125 million budget, bigger than any of his previous films, but was not too far away from the scope he was used to working. This is mainly due to Cameron not believing that the film would require that many special effects, and the bulk of the production work would be taken up by set construction. And in doing this, they created the largest film set in history at the time. A near 1-to-1 scale replica of the Titanic, sitting in a plot of land the studio owned just for the movie. And while a good portion of the budget was allocated to the set as well as the cast, something Cameron far underestimated was the visual effects. As previously mentioned, a love story between two people on a sinking ship isn't necessarily one that sought to require extensive effects work. But in order to achieve the vision Cameron had for the film, the scale of the production was upped from what it was initially conceived. This also meant that it went far beyond its production schedule and its budget ballooned to a whopping $200 million, making it the most expensive movie ever made at that time.
Yeah, you weren't lying to him. You just figured that's it.
No, in fact, that's why I wound up giving him back all my money, because I said, guys, I don't want you to think we lied to you just to get you to make this movie.
Right. So in other words, like they came to you, made the deal, and you said, hey, you get a couple of million just for making the movie.
Right.
And you said to him halfway through the shooting or something, hey, here's the money back?
Yeah, exactly.
Titanic really was the kind of movie that wasn't made anymore. A big Hollywood epic akin to ones such as Ben-Hur or Gone with the Wind. A 3-hour period film with no chance of a sequel during a time when either mid-budget movies or action films were reigning supreme. Titanic opened in December 1997 to rave reviews from all over the world and had an extremely successful theatrical run. In fact, the weekend gross actually increased week after week as time went on, an absolute rarity to happen in Hollywood. Despite industry insiders ready to make predictable headlines of Titanic sinks again, this time at the box office, Titanic became an enormous worldwide success, making just under $2.2 billion and becoming the most successful movie ever made at that time. The following year, Titanic swept the Academy Awards, earning 11 Oscars, including Best Visual Effects, Best Director.
I'm the king of the world!
By the way, James caught a lot of crap for saying that for some reason. And the top prize, Best Picture. And you'd think after all of this praise and accolade, Cameron would rush to complete his next film right away, right? Well, Not exactly. Throughout the 2000s, he was on and off in the filmmaking world, co-creating the show Dark Angel and producing the film Solaris, most notably. But there was something else he was cooking up in the meantime, this time with him back in the director's chair. By the mid-2000s, visual effects had come a long way from what Cameron was working with even a few years prior on Titanic. So he decided to brush off that script he had written in '95 and see if it would be feasible to work on again. The script was titled Avatar, a story about the military sent to a resource-rich planet called Pandora, inhabited by a native species called the Na'vi. In order to learn more about them, they implemented an experimental program where users were able to take control of a body bred for them. One Marine, Jake Sully, instead falls in love with a Na'vi woman named Natiri and decides to go rogue and live among them. The film began production in 2005, where early designs and concept art were created. Cameron says that he was inspired by images that came to him in college of bioluminescent forests, which is what became the overall aesthetic for Pandora. He hired linguist Dr. Paul Frommer to create a full-fledged language of the Na'vi as well. Cameron clearly wanted the world, culture, and ecology of the film to take center stage, which once again highlighted his fascination with the sea and wildlife. After seeing what could be done with motion capture technology with Gollum and the Lord of the Rings, as well as Robert Zemeckis' mocap films at the time, the scope of what he was looking to do was well within what he originally intended. Filming began in April of 2007 for all of the motion capture, and then in October of 2007 for the live-action scenes. Keeping with the tradition of Cameron upping the scale of each of his productions, this one naturally had an even bigger budget than his previous films, with the spokesperson from Fox claiming that the film had a $237 million budget, but other sources put it in the ballpark of $280 to $310 million. Post-production went through 2008 and well into 2009, pushing its anticipated summer release date to December to complete its complex visual effects. Exactly what happened with Titanic. And when the trailer dropped in August of 2009, it was met with an incredibly mixed and lukewarm reception. Now keep in mind, this is still the late 2000s, during the dawn of social media, so online discourse wasn't as splintered and nuanced as it is now. So if the whole of the internet is giving your movie a shrug, that's not a good sign. It wasn't until Cameron and company came up with an utterly ingenious marketing tactic where things would begin to turn around. Basically what they did was took the Banshees flying sequence from the film, put it in a bunch of IMAX theaters across the US, and told people leaving other movies that they're able to watch 10 minutes of a new film for free if they'd like. This meant theater upon theater of people would be getting to see one of the most visually immersive scenes in the movie in 3D completely free just a few short months before the movie's release. And after this implemented, enthusiasm for the film went through the roof.
Interesting, the trailer for the film went out the day before, and the trailer got a very mixed response.
There was this sense of, well, what's all the fuss about? This looks like, Smurfs or Thundercats or whatever. And pretty soon they're ripping us a new one on the internet, 7,500 comments long about how bad this movie is and how it's doomed to fail. And then John Lando and I came up with this idea to do Avatar Day.
Avatar Day was where we went out and we took over theaters and we invited audience members to come for free to see 15 minutes of the movie in 3D around the world. When people went and saw it in the theater and didn't see it in a minute and a half or a 2-minute trailer, but saw 15 minutes of the movie, the response was overwhelming.
Avatar was released in December 2009 to very positive crowd reactions, and just like Titanic before, it grew in popularity as time went on. And also just like Titanic, it took the #1 spot of the highest grossing film of all time, ending its theatrical run with $2.9 billion. So for the second film in a row, Cameron was not only able to make a box office smash, but deliver a film that would make more money than any other film in history. The following year during the Academy Awards, Avatar managed to score 3 wins, one of which for... come on, take a guess. Soon after this, Cameron confirmed that he was working on not one, but several Avatar sequels, which would come out... He vanished again, didn't he? As he busied himself with other projects and humanitarian efforts he was involved in, filming on Avatar 2 didn't actually commence until sometime in 2017. Still a 5-year gap from its release, he was actually filming Avatars 2, 3, and parts of 4 at the same time, and was also laying the groundwork for doing the effects for all these films during this time. As the saying goes, the factory has to be built before the first can of peas can be shipped to the supermarket. During this long hiatus, however, the public had adopted a sort of anti-Avatar sentiment, possibly due to how long it was taking for the supposed sequels to come out, and also once the hype for the first film died down, people began to see its faults such as a thin story and underdeveloped characters. It was also hurt in the fact that both Titanic and Avatar would be usurped by Avengers Endgame in 2019 as the highest grossing movie ever made. Although Avatar reclaimed that spot not too long after due to a couple of re-releases. On top of comments that Cameron made, which came off somewhat out of bitter jealousy about the whole thing, people began to see him as a filmmaker stuck in the past, not willing to adapt. That is, not until they got a look under the hood. The trailer for Avatar 2, now dubbed The Way of Water, premiered in the summer of 2022 online and elsewhere to a surprisingly warm reception. You have to remember, Avatar isn't a series that had much else besides a movie. No sequels, no TV series. This was people's first real look at the franchise since 2009. The main thing which dominated the discussion was how photorealistic the effects looked, particularly the water. And just as well, as the film had an estimated budget between $350 to $460 million. Although those numbers are more likely going to be shored up as time progresses. It also shows off how the filmmakers developed 6 new patents for water simulation. Now, water is something that CG has been able to pull off well for some time, but it wasn't until The Way of Water where it seemingly looked perfected. As the months went on, it seems more and more people had warmed up to the idea of seeing the film. And in December 2022, Avatar: The Way of Water released in theaters to rave reviews and extremely successful box office numbers. A lot of which were aided by people who were so taken by the spectacle that once were negative on the series that had now come around on it. And in just a few short weeks, Avatar: The Way of Water has launched itself to becoming the 6th most successful movie of all time, and as of the making of this video shows no signs of stopping. So after all that, there's still a question that remains unanswered. Why are James Cameron's films specifically such a hit both critically and especially financially? Well, let's take a closer look at them, shall we? There's always a lot of talk of how Hollywood is built on sequels and adaptations as audiences tend to gravitate towards the familiar. But how true is that here? Well, let's take a look at his filmography as a whole. Not counting his first, which he never got to fully complete, he's only directed 8 films. Only 3 of which were sequels, and 1 was a remake. 1 was based on a historical event, but not necessarily any book or previous work. And the last 3 were original. This means that nearly half of his filmography are wholly original ideas, and all of which proved successful. One of which, again, is the highest grossing film of all time. But the 3 that were sequels were all massive successes. Were they aided by the first films in their franchises being hits? Absolutely. But there are countless examples of movies which were hits that had sequels which bombed both critically and financially. Yet these 3, particularly 2 of them, are contenders for sequels that are just as good, if not better than the original. So I'm not convinced that his movies are hits primarily because of pre-existing franchises. I think it has more to do with how the films were presented. People didn't see Terminator 2 more than the first because it had the brand of the first film, or even because the effects were better. They went to it because they felt the action scenes and story were better. If you were to copy the first Terminator's story structure, except this time the only difference is in a beefier budget, don't expect blockbuster crowds to wrap around the theater. And going to his original films, in contrast, I don't think people showed up in droves to Avatar because it presented a gripping and wholly original story. They went to it because of the spectacle it presented. It was essentially treated like a ride, bringing you to a 3D world to escape into. James Cameron's films are profitable because they provide something that is universally appealing: spectacle. They have stories that, while at times feel lacking, touch us on an emotional level while also providing an exciting theater-going experience. As George Lucas once said,
special effects are just a tool, a means of telling a story. People have a tendency to confuse them as an end to themselves. A special effect without a story is a pretty boring thing.
Funny coming from him, I know, but it's true. He provides the kind of escapism the public craves while also giving enough emotional involvement for the audience to care about what's going on. Now, it does seem Cameron is content making Avatar films until he retires. Whether it be historical epics, sci-fi environmentalist films, or high-genre action, he can pull in audiences that wouldn't normally see those types of films. He is the perfect balance of artistry and commercial viability.
His name is James Cameron, the bravest pioneer. No budget too steep, no sea too deep. Who's that? It's him, James Cameron.